The sharp sting across my left cheek did not register immediately. It felt more like a sudden burst of heat, radiating outward from my cheekbone down to my jaw, pulsing time with my suddenly racing heartbeat. I was sitting at a perfectly set, excessively long dining table, surrounded by 12 members of my husband's family. The heavy crystal wine glasses caught the dim amber light of the incredibly expensive chandelier suspended above us, casting fractured shadows across the imported mahogany wood. The silence in the room was entirely deafening. No one gasped. No one moved to intervene. No one even shifted in their heavy leather chairs. His mother, Eleanor, simply took a slow, highly calculated sip of her expensive Merlot, her dark eyes fixed on me with a look of undeniable mild amusement. My husband, Mark, stood towering over my chair, his chest heaving slightly, his large hands still hovering in the cold air between us, as if he was contemplating striking me a second time. He had just hit me across the face in front of his entire family because I had politely but firmly declined to co-sign a massive, incredibly risky loan for his younger brother's failing business venture. The physical pain was secondary to the absolute shock of the humiliation. He leaned down closely, his voice a venomous, trembling whisper that was meant only for me, but it carried easily in the absolute dead quiet of the private dining room. He told me I was a nobody, a penniless, ungrateful liability he had taken deep pity on, and that I needed to learn my exact place in his highly esteemed, wealthy family. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my trembling hand to comfort my stinging, bright red face. I could have screamed. I could have violently flipped the table and shattered the crystal, but I realized something profoundly important in that exact frozen second of time. I just looked up at him, feeling the absolute, undeniable death of our 5-year marriage settling into my chest like a heavy stone. The man I thought I loved was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, violent stranger. But here is what they didn't know. Mark had absolutely no idea who my father really was, nor did he understand the sheer magnitude of the mistake he had just made. He thought he was exerting dominance over a weak, isolated woman. He didn't know that very soon, that blind arrogance was going to cost him absolutely everything he had ever valued in his pathetic, status-obsessed life. Let me back up a little bit so you can clearly understand how I ended up sitting at a formal dinner table with a man who genuinely thought he could physically assault me without any severe consequences. My name is Clara. For the entirety of my adult life, I have operated under a carefully constructed, highly intentional veil of absolute mediocrity. I drive a reliable, deeply unexciting 7-year-old sedan. I shop at standard mid-tier department stores, and I work a quiet, remote job in data analysis that pays a comfortable but entirely modest salary. I live exactly like an average middle-class woman in her late 20s, trying to navigate a difficult economy. That was a very deliberate, strategic choice on my part. What I never disclosed to anyone in my daily life, including the man I eventually married and shared a home with, is that my father is one of the most ruthless, feared, and wildly successful corporate acquisition specialists on the entire Eastern Seaboard. He literally builds massive financial empires, and more importantly, he clinically dismantles them. Growing up, I saw exactly what extreme wealth, power, and relentless ambition did to human beings, and it absolutely terrified me. I spent my childhood watching my father's wealthy associates marry purely for social status, betray their oldest friends for lucrative corporate board seats, and treat the working class like entirely disposable stepping stones to build their own fortunes. I deeply hated it. I wanted absolutely no part of that cold, gilded cage where every interaction was a transaction. So when I went away to a distant university, I completely dropped my family's highly recognizable, incredibly powerful surname and legally adopted my mother's obscure, utterly common maiden name. I wanted to be loved and respected for who I actually was, not for my massive trust fund or my father's immense, terrifying shadow in the business world. Looking back, that was undoubtedly my first catastrophic mistake. I sought normalcy and genuine human connection so desperately that I entirely blinded myself to the predatory, highly calculating nature of the man I eventually invited into my life. I assumed that because Mark wasn't a billionaire, he was safe. I assumed his ambition was healthy, rather than a toxic desperation to climb a social ladder he felt he deserved to be at the top of. I met Mark at a small, independent coffee shop where I spent my quiet Sunday mornings reading thick paperback novels. He was incredibly charming, aggressively confident, and wore a sharply tailored suit that easily cost more than the Kelly Blue Book value of my first car. He introduced himself as an up-and-coming commercial real estate developer, always talking endlessly about his massive upcoming deals, his family's supposed grand legacy, and how he was going to entirely conquer the city's skyline. I found his intense ambition endearing at first. He seemed like a dedicated, self-made man who genuinely valued hard work and long hours. During our first year of dating, he was fiercely protective, incredibly attentive, and showered me with a type of affection I had never experienced. But looking back through the lens of reality, there was always this highly subtle underlying current of social superiority in everything he did. It started with small, seemingly harmless comments that I foolishly brushed aside in the name of love. He would casually, almost playfully, critique my modest wardrobe, gently suggesting I dress a little more elegantly when meeting his important business colleagues. He would absolutely insist on paying for every single dinner, but he always made a highly intentional point to loudly mention exactly how much the exorbitant bill was. It felt as though he was constantly trying to remind me of the luxurious lifestyle he was so graciously providing for me, a supposed poor girl from a highly forgettable background. I completely brushed these deeply uncomfortable moments off as mere arrogance, the harmless side effect of navigating a highly competitive, cutthroat career path. I constantly rationalized his increasingly elitist behavior, telling myself that he was just incredibly stressed or simply trying to impress his highly demanding, highly judgmental family. I fell deeply in love with the kind, attentive man he pretended to be during those quiet, private Sunday mornings in my tiny, cheap apartment, completely ignoring the way his sharp eyes would scan my inexpensive particle board furniture with barely concealed disgust. He genuinely thought he was dating a pleasant, highly submissive, completely isolated girl from a poor background who would be forever grateful for his mere attention. He wasn't looking for a true partner. He was grooming a compliant prop to stand silently beside him at charity galas. Now, you need to understand something crucial about my mother-in-law before I tell you what happened next. Eleanor was the undisputed matriarch of the family, a terrifyingly bitter woman whose entire personal identity was aggressively wrapped up in exclusive country club memberships, imported designer handbags, and constantly maintaining the heavy illusion of old generational wealth. From the very first moment Mark introduced me to her in the foyer of her home, she made it abundantly, painfully clear that I was an entirely unwelcome stain on their pristine, carefully curated family portrait. I vividly remember our first formal dinner at her sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate in the suburbs. She looked me up and down slowly, her dark eyes lingering heavily on my simple, inexpensive silver necklace, before turning to Mark and loudly asking if he had met me at a local charity clothing drive. The entire room went dead silent, waiting for my reaction. I didn't say a single word. I just smiled politely, taking a slow, calm sip of my ice water, absolutely refusing to give her the immense satisfaction of seeing me flinch or cry. Over the passing years, Eleanor's sharp microaggressions became a completely standard, expected part of our toxic relationship. She would wrap up condescending self-help books on basic social etiquette and present them to me at family Christmas exchanges. She would loudly and aggressively ask her underpaid maids to immediately clean up after me, heavily implying I was entirely too uncultured to know how to properly use a stone coaster. And the most heartbreaking part? Mark never once defended me. He never stood up for the woman he claimed to love. In fact, he would frequently laugh along with her cruel jokes, pulling me aside later to tell me I desperately needed to develop a thicker skin, and that his mother simply had incredibly high standards for the family. He was utterly terrified of her, completely financially dependent on her social approval for his early, highly leveraged business loans, and he was entirely willing to sacrifice my basic human dignity just to keep her completely happy. I silently endured the constant humiliation because I foolishly believed that marriage meant weathering the difficult storms together, no matter how painful they became. I was incredibly naive to think my patience would eventually win them over. The dynamic of our marriage began to shift dramatically and violently during our 4th year together. Mark's supposedly brilliant real estate venture started hitting massive, entirely catastrophic roadblocks. He had deeply over-leveraged himself on a massive luxury condominium development that had completely stalled due to severe zoning issues and incredibly poor management. The charming, confident, highly attentive man I had married slowly evaporated into thin air, completely replaced by a bitter, rage, highly paranoid tyrant who drank entirely too much expensive single malt scotch and aggressively blamed everyone else in the city for his own profound failures. The unseen financial strain on him was immense, though he tried desperately, almost pathologically, to hide it from his wealthy country club friends and his judgmental mother. At home, behind closed doors, he became fiercely, terrifyingly controlling. He started ruthlessly scrutinizing my modest personal bank statements, aggressively demanding to know why I wasn't financially contributing significantly more to the household. This was deeply hypocritical, despite the absolute fact that I quietly paid for all of our daily groceries, the massive utility bills, and every single one of my own personal expenses out of my own modest paycheck. He violently insisted that we maintain his lavish, entirely fake lifestyle, the expensive leased luxury vehicles, the extravagant downtown dinners, the incredibly expensive jewelry for his mother's birthdays, all while his actual business rapidly bled money from every single artery. When I gently and calmly suggested we perhaps downsize our lifestyle and live within our actual realistic financial means until the market recovered, he completely exploded. That was the very first time I saw genuine, unadulterated hatred burning in his bloodshot eyes. He aggressively backed me into the cold marble edge of the kitchen counter, pointing a violently trembling finger directly in my face, and told me that a small-minded, pathetic peasant like me could never possibly understand the immense pressures of building a massive corporate empire. He spat the words at me, saying I was incredibly lucky he hadn't divorced me years ago for someone in his own elite tax bracket. The carefully constructed mask was finally and entirely off. The kind man I once loved was dead and gone, leaving only this frantic, deeply insecure, highly dangerous bully standing in his place in my kitchen. The situation rapidly and violently deteriorated when Mark's younger, deeply spoiled brother, David, suddenly decided he wanted to open a high-end, incredibly pretentious fusion restaurant downtown. The entire family essentially functioned on this deeply toxic, highly destructive cycle of aggressively borrowing money they absolutely did not have in order to fund ridiculous businesses they completely lacked the intelligence to actually run. David needed a massive, life-altering business loan, but his personal credit was completely destroyed from a previous, highly embarrassing failed startup venture a few years prior. The family's actual liquid assets were already completely tied up in Mark's rapidly sinking real estate project. That was exactly when they turned their desperate, highly predatory eyes directly toward me. Mark knew perfectly well that I had absolutely excellent credit, I lived incredibly frugally, had absolutely zero outstanding debt, and possessed a pristine, highly attractive financial history that banks loved. One rainy Tuesday evening, Mark sat me down at the dining table and aggressively presented a massive stack of highly complex loan documents, flatly demanding that I immediately co-sign a $400,000 business loan for his deeply irresponsible brother. He didn't gently ask. He didn't present it as a partnership. He aggressively ordered me to sign it. He loudly told me it was my absolute, undisputed duty as a lowly member of this family to finally step up and prove my worth, completely ignoring the sheer fact that his family had treated me like absolute human garbage for half a decade. When I slowly and carefully read through the dense legal paperwork, I saw the absolute, horrifying truth hidden in the fine print. The massive loan was deeply predatory, the variable interest rates were entirely astronomical, and worst of all, it explicitly required using our marital home, the beautiful house I had personally contributed a massive, life savings down payment toward, as the primary collateral. If David's doomed restaurant inevitably failed, which it absolutely and spectacularly would, the ruthless bank would immediately seize my home and aggressively garnish my modest wages for the rest of my life. They were actively, intentionally trying to use me as a disposable financial human shield. They genuinely thought I was entirely too stupid and deeply intimidated by their faux wealth to actually read the dense legal fine print. I felt a cold chill run down my entire spine as I realized the absolute malice of their plan. I calmly, without raising my voice a single decibel, told Mark I absolutely needed a few days to thoroughly review the dense legal documents before signing anything of that magnitude. He violently scoffed, aggressively calling me paranoid and entirely unsupportive, but he reluctantly agreed, completely assuming I would eventually just fold under his relentless, crushing emotional pressure. Over the next 3 highly stressful days, I did not just passively review the terrible loan documents. I quietly, using a highly secure encrypted connection, hired a massive private forensic accounting firm to aggressively dig into the hidden finances of Mark's supposedly successful business, David's highly proposed restaurant, and the family's overall hidden estate. What the brilliant forensic accountant quickly found made my blood run absolutely cold in my veins. Mark wasn't just struggling financially, he was standing directly on the precipice of catastrophic, highly public bankruptcy. He was secretly facing multiple massive lawsuits from angry contractors he entirely hadn't paid in over 8 months. Even worse, the forensic accountant discovered a highly complex series of heavily hidden offshore accounts where Mark had been systematically siphoning the little money we actually did have in our joint marital savings to quietly pay off highly aggressive, dangerous personal debts he had accumulated. The massive loan for David's pretentious restaurant was an absolute, complete sham. They weren't actually building a restaurant at all. They were entirely conspiring to use my pristine credit to legally secure the $400,000 in cash, funnel that money directly into Mark's failing shell company to temporarily keep the furious creditors at bay, and completely leave me holding the empty bag when the entire fragile house of cards finally collapsed. They were actively, enthusiastically conspiring to entirely ruin my financial life, simply to save their own fragile, pathetic egos. I sat alone in my quiet, dark home office, staring blankly at the undeniable, highly documented proof of their absolute betrayal on my glowing laptop screen. The sheer, highly calculated malice of it all completely took my breath away. They genuinely, truly believed I was absolutely nothing but a dumb, entirely disposable asset to be drained and discarded. This horrifying, life-altering discovery brought us directly to the fateful night of the highly infamous, violently explosive family dinner. And Eleanor had carefully orchestrated a grand, incredibly excessive family gathering at an obscenely expensive private dining club to publicly celebrate the supposed launch of David's entirely fake new business venture. It was a completely theatrical, highly manipulated setup, entirely designed to physically corner me into signing the financial papers in front of a massive audience. They had explicitly reserved the exclusive back room of a restaurant known for its incredibly pretentious, highly overpriced French cuisine. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tightly shut, completely isolating us from the rest of the oblivious patrons, creating a deeply suffocating atmosphere of forced intimacy. As I slowly walked into the dimly lit room, the entire family was already seated, laughing loudly and aggressively clinking their expensive champagne glasses together in preemptive celebration. Eleanor sat proudly at the absolute center of the long table, wearing a deeply garish diamond necklace she could never actually afford, looking at me with a completely manufactured, highly predatory smile that did not even slightly reach her cold eyes. Mark immediately rushed over, aggressively pulling out my heavy wooden chair with a forced, highly theatrical display of chivalry that made my skin completely crawl. Nestled quietly right next to my pristine white porcelain dinner plate was a thick, highly intimidating stack of legal documents and a heavy, expensive fountain pen. They truly believed they had perfectly orchestrated the ultimate, highly inescapable trap, completely confident that the immense social pressure of the entire gathered family would force my trembling hand to sign my life away. The massive, multi-course dinner agonizingly dragged on for nearly 2 excruciating hours, completely filled with highly exaggerated, entirely fabricated stories of Mark's supposed business triumphs and David's visionary restaurant concepts. Every single conversation was highly calculated, aggressively designed to completely isolate me and make me feel incredibly small and entirely grateful just to be allowed in their majestic presence. Finally, as the sharply dressed waiters quietly cleared away the remnants of our incredibly rich, heavily buttered desserts, the mood in the room abruptly and violently shifted. Eleanor deliberately tapped her silver spoon against her crystal glass, demanding absolute silence, before nodding sharply toward her eldest son. Mark slowly picked up the thick stack of predatory loan papers, his hands trembling very slightly with barely concealed, desperate anticipation. He slid the documents directly across the smooth mahogany wood until they rested perfectly in front of me, forcefully uncapping the heavy fountain pen and pressing it directly into my palm. He leaned in closely, heavily smelling of expensive scotch and raw desperation, loudly declaring that it was finally time to make this highly lucrative family business officially move forward. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, a small, completely unreadable expression that caused a sudden, highly noticeable flicker of deep confusion to quickly cross Mark's arrogant face. I slowly and deliberately set the expensive fountain pen down onto the pristine white tablecloth, completely ignoring the massive stack of highly predatory legal documents. I looked directly into Mark's deeply bloodshot eyes and stated, in a completely calm, entirely unwavering voice, that I had absolutely no intention of ever signing those papers, nor would I ever allow my home to be used to fraudulently fund his failing shell company. The silence in the room was deafening, a profound, terrifying emptiness that I will permanently remember for the rest of my entire life. The smug, highly arrogant smiles completely vanished from 12 different faces simultaneously, instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated shock and rapidly mounting panic. Mark's face flushed a deep, violently angry crimson, the veins in his neck bulging aggressively against his tightly fastened silk collar. That was the exact, highly volatile moment when his massive, fragile ego completely shattered, leading directly to the sudden, violent burst of heat across my cheek as he struck me. The sheer, undeniable violence of that single, desperate action completely solidified every single terrifying thing I had ever suspected about a man I had foolishly married. As I sat there in the deafening, horrific silence of that private dining room, with his hands still hovering in the cold air and his mother smiling her deeply sick, highly amused smile, a profound, icy calm entirely washed over my entire body. I didn't cry a single tear, nor did I frantically raise my hand to comfort my burning bright red cheek. I simply pushed my heavy wooden chair back, the loud, deeply abrasive scraping sound violently piercing the absolute quiet of the room. I slowly stood up, smoothing down the front of my modest, entirely inexpensive dress with perfectly steady, highly deliberate hands. I looked slowly around the long table, deeply memorizing the pathetic, highly cowardly faces of every single person who had just sat completely silent while a woman was physically assaulted. Without raising my voice a single fraction, I coldly informed Mark that he would deeply and profoundly regret this evening for the rest of his miserable, pathetic existence. Then, I turned my back on them and walked slowly out into the freezing night air. The biting, freezing wind of the city immediately hit my face as I stepped out onto the wet, highly reflective pavement, but I barely registered the freezing temperature. My heart was beating with a slow, completely methodical, highly dangerous rhythm, absolutely stripped of any lingering affection or foolish hope I had ever harbored for my marriage. I sat quietly in the driver's seat of my unexciting, highly reliable 7-year-old sedan, staring blankly through the rain-streaked windshield for nearly 30 full minutes in absolute silence. I was meticulously, highly strategically planning the exact, catastrophic downfall of the entire arrogant family that had just attempted to permanently destroy my life. Reaching into my purse, I pulled out my heavily encrypted cell phone and dialed a highly secure private number I had actively avoided calling for nearly a decade. The phone rang exactly twice before a deep, incredibly calm, instantly recognizable voice answered on the other end. It was my father, the ruthless, highly feared corporate titan who had built an entire, massive empire on systematically and clinically dismantling failing businesses and completely crushing arrogant, incompetent men, just like Mark. I didn't offer any lengthy, highly emotional apologies for my years of stubborn, completely intentional estrangement, nor did I break down crying about the violent, deeply humiliating end of my marriage. I simply and calmly told him exactly what had transpired over the last 4 years, heavily detailing the massive financial fraud Mark was secretly running, the highly predatory loan they had aggressively tried to force upon me, and finally, the violent, unforgivable strike across my face in that private dining room. The absolute silence on the other end of the secure line was thick, heavy, and deeply terrifying. When my father finally spoke, his voice was utterly devoid of any outward, highly dramatic anger, which I knew from deep personal experience was infinitely more dangerous than a loud, violent explosion. He didn't yell or aggressively demand immediate, bloody retaliation. He simply asked me, in a cold, entirely clinical tone, exactly how thoroughly and completely I wanted to dismantle the man who had just assaulted his only daughter. I told them I wanted Mark and his deeply toxic family to lose absolutely everything they had ever valued, down to their deeply fake, entirely manufactured country club reputations. Now, you need to understand something incredibly important about how true, massive generational wealth actually operates in the real world when it goes to war. The wealthy do not aggressively scream in the streets, they do not throw violent punches, and they certainly do not waste their valuable time engaging in deeply petty, highly emotional screaming matches. They utilize brilliant, highly aggressive corporate lawyers, entirely quiet backdoor financial acquisitions, and the sheer crushing weight of entirely legal, highly complex debt structures. Over the next exactly 14 days, I engaged in the most brilliant, highly stressful performance of my entire life, operating fully in the terrifying, completely silent phase of the calm before the massive storm. I intentionally did not file for divorce, I did not pack my bags, and I did not flee the marital home in a highly dramatic, tearful panic. Instead, I calmly returned to the house that very same night, completely locking myself in the guest bedroom while Mark aggressively pounded on the heavy wooden door, loudly demanding that I apologize to his mother for deeply ruining their important family celebration. I let him entirely believe he was still firmly in control of the situation. The next morning, I calmly and quietly told Mark through the locked door that I was deeply shocked, heavily traumatized, and entirely needed a few weeks to emotionally process everything before we discussed the financial paperwork again. This was a highly calculated, entirely strategic lie, meant solely to buy my father's massive legal team the exact amount of time they desperately needed to silently go to work. Mark, completely blinded by his own massive arrogance and deeply desperate need for the funds, fully believed I was simply a weak, terrified woman slowly capitulating to his absolute dominance. While he spent his days aggressively attempting to placate his furiously angry creditors with entirely empty promises, my father's massive, highly feared holding company quietly began aggressively purchasing every single piece of Mark's outstanding debt. They entirely bought out the massively overdue contracts from his furious construction suppliers. They quietly purchased the highly toxic, failing loans on his stalled luxury condominium project. And they systematically bought every single personal marker he owed to his highly dangerous, entirely unofficial private lenders. But my father and I did not just stop at Mark's entirely disastrous, highly fraudulent business ventures. We aimed much higher and significantly deeper into the toxic family structure. Eleanor's deeply cherished, heavily guarded secret was that her massive, sprawling suburban estate, the absolute crown jewel of her entirely manufactured social identity, was drowning in multiple, highly toxic secondary mortgages she could barely afford to service. She had foolishly leveraged the massive property multiple times to actively fund her incredibly expensive, completely fake lifestyle and to silently bail Mark out of his early, highly embarrassing business failures, using a deeply obscure, highly complex network of completely anonymous shell companies. My father's brilliant corporate acquisition team entirely bought out the heavily defaulted notes on Eleanor's massive estate from the highly aggressive private lenders who were entirely eager to offload the massive risk. Within exactly 12 days of the violent incident at the restaurant, my family essentially and completely owned Mark, Eleanor, and every single tangible asset they had ever falsely claimed as their own. The absolute trap was quietly, perfectly, and inescapably set. Living in that massive, deeply tense house with Mark during those 2 weeks was a masterclass in extreme, highly controlled psychological endurance. I could smell the sharp, deeply pungent scent of his expensive, heavily applied cologne, desperately trying to mask the highly noticeable sweat of his constant, waking panic as his phone relentlessly buzzed with unknown numbers. He would frequently pace heavily back and forth across the expensive hardwood floors, late at night, aggressively muttering to himself and furiously drinking cheap vodka because he could no longer actually afford his favorite single malt scotch. I didn't say a word. I just smiled politely whenever we unfortunately crossed paths in the massive kitchen, completely maintaining the deeply satisfying illusion that he was still carefully contemplating signing the massive, highly predatory loan documents for David's fake restaurant. Mark genuinely thought he was a brilliant, highly manipulative mastermind, slowly wearing down a weak, entirely isolated target. He had absolutely no idea that every single time his phone urgently buzzed with a blocked number, it was my father's highly aggressive legal team, completely locking the invisible, heavy chains around his neck. I could have quietly served him standard divorce papers, legally forced a highly messy, deeply prolonged division of our few remaining shared assets, and simply walked away to slowly heal my deep emotional wounds. But I realized something fundamentally important while sitting completely alone in my locked guest bedroom, listening to him furiously scream at another unpaid contractor over the phone. Toxic, highly narcissistic abusers like Mark and Eleanor absolutely never truly learn from quiet, deeply dignified exits. They simply twist the narrative to make themselves the highly tragic victims and quickly move on to systematically destroy their next unsuspecting target. They absolutely needed to be publicly, entirely stripped of the one single thing they valued far above absolutely anything else in the world, their completely manufactured, deeply arrogant illusion of superior social status and massive financial power. I wanted them to clearly and undeniably see the absolute destruction of their entire pathetic empire, and I specifically wanted them to know exactly whose hand was firmly holding the match that burned it all directly to the ground. The massive, highly anticipated day of the final, absolute confrontation arrived on a perfectly crisp, entirely clear Tuesday morning. I calmly and pleasantly informed Mark that I was finally completely ready to officially sign the massive, highly predatory loan document, but I absolutely insisted that the final signing take place in a highly professional, entirely neutral setting rather than a loud, deeply unpredictable restaurant. Mark's completely exhausted, heavily bloodshot eyes immediately lit up with entirely unrestrained, deeply greedy triumph. He was absolutely, practically salivating at the immediate thought of the massive influx of stolen cash that would temporarily save his completely fraudulent, deeply failing shell company. I told him my supposed small-time personal lawyer had quietly arranged a heavily discounted conference room at a massive, highly intimidating corporate building downtown, and I strongly requested that his mother and his brother David absolutely be present to officially witness the final familial agreement. Mark entirely eagerly agreed, utterly convinced that this highly public spectacle was his ultimate, crowning victory over my stubborn independence. The location I had carefully selected was not some entirely cheap, completely generic rented office space, but the massive, highly exclusive, deeply intimidating top-floor boardroom of my father's absolutely massive corporate headquarters. As I slowly walked into the massive glass-walled lobby, the deeply polished marble floors perfectly reflecting the massive, highly expensive modern art installations, I felt an incredibly profound, highly satisfying sense of absolute calm entirely wash over me. The incredibly polite, sharply dressed security guards at the main desk immediately recognized me, silently offering deeply respectful nods as they quickly bypassed the massive security gates to escort me directly to the private, highly secured executive elevators. I stepped into the completely silent, mahogany-paneled boardroom on the absolute top floor, slowly taking my highly designated seat at the absolute head of the massive, 60-foot polished granite conference table. The heavy room absolutely commanded entirely unspoken, deeply terrifying power, boasting massive, panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows that completely overlooked the entire bustling, highly competitive financial district far below. I simply sat quietly and waited. Precisely 15 minutes later, the massive, highly heavy oak doors of the boardroom slowly swung open, and Mark, Eleanor, and David confidently strutted into the massive room. They were entirely dressed in their absolute, most aggressively expensive designer clothing, deeply desperate to heavily project an absolute aura of massive wealth and unquestionable superiority in what they foolishly assumed was just a rented, highly generic corporate space. Eleanor aggressively clutched her deeply fake, highly recognizable designer handbag, immediately turning her nose up at the incredibly sparse, highly modern decor, completely ignorant to the absolute fact that the single, deeply abstract painting hanging on the far wall was easily worth significantly more than her entire heavily mortgaged estate. Mark strutted aggressively toward the massive table, heavily reeking of completely misplaced arrogance and entirely unlearned confidence, deeply clutching a highly worn leather briefcase containing the massive, entirely fraudulent loan documents. They genuinely, truly believed they were walking into a deeply standard, highly routine bank signing. They were absolutely walking directly into a highly sophisticated, completely inescapable corporate slaughterhouse. Mark aggressively threw his heavy leather briefcase onto the pristine, highly polished granite table with a loud, deeply abrasive thud, violently pulling out a heavy middle pen with a deeply smug, highly victorious smirk permanently plastered across his arrogant face. He didn't even slightly bother to ask why I was entirely sitting at the absolute head of the massive, highly intimidating table, nor did he seemingly notice the three deeply serious, highly expensive corporate lawyers completely dressed in immaculate charcoal suits, quietly standing in the deep shadows at the back of the massive room. Eleanor immediately began loudly and aggressively complaining about the completely terrible quality of the complimentary sparkling water, deeply demanding that a secretary immediately fetch her a highly specific brand of expensive imported tea. The absolute silence in the massive room was completely deafening, utterly thick with highly dangerous, completely unseen tension. I didn't say a single word. I just smiled, a deeply cold, highly calculated expression that finally, slowly caused Mark's arrogant, deeply stupid smirk to very slightly falter as he completely failed to comprehend the massive power dynamic shift rapidly occurring right in front of his eye. Before Mark could loudly and aggressively demand that I immediately sign the thick stack of entirely predatory papers, the massive, highly heavy oak doors silently opened one final time. My father slowly and deliberately walked into the massive boardroom, instantly and completely sucking all the available oxygen directly out of the massive space with his sheer, deeply terrifying presence. He didn't look like a standard, highly loud corporate bully. He looked exactly like an entirely ruthless, deeply apex predator wearing a completely custom-tailored, highly conservative, dark suit. He slowly and methodically walked entirely past the deeply confused, highly shocked family, completely ignoring their entirely pathetic, heavily confused existence, and quietly took the highly designated seat directly to my immediate right. Mark's heavily bloodshot eyes violently darted frantically back and forth between me and the deeply terrifying older man who had just completely commandeered his supposedly highly triumphant moment. Eleanor's highly aggressive, completely fake complaints about the sparkling water entirely died in her tight throat as she slowly recognized my father's highly famous, deeply feared face from countless expensive financial magazine covers. Mark violently cleared his highly dry throat, aggressively attempting to fiercely regain complete control of the rapidly deteriorating situation by puffing out his chest and loudly demanding to know exactly who this random, completely uninvited man was and why he was aggressively interrupting a highly private family financial matter. My father didn't immediately answer him. He simply slowly raised a highly manicured, completely steady hand, and the three heavily armed corporate lawyers silently stepped completely out of the deep shadows, instantly placing three massive, highly intimidating stacks of incredibly thick, deeply official legal binders directly onto the highly polished granite table in front of Mark, Eleanor, and David. I leaned slightly forward, resting my completely steady hands on the cold granite, and looked entirely and deeply into Mark's completely terrified, rapidly dilating eyes. I calmly and quietly introduced my father to my highly abusive husband, strongly watching the absolute, completely unadulterated horror instantly and violently wash over Mark's entirely pale face as the absolute, crushing reality of his massive, highly catastrophic mistake finally and completely shattered his fragile mind. The exact moment the highly massive, completely undeniable realization fully hit them was utterly and completely intoxicating to silently witness. Mark physically stumbled slightly backward, his highly expensive Italian leather shoes loudly, violently scraping against the deeply polished marble floor, his mouth opening and completely closing like a highly pathetic, deeply desperate fish completely entirely out of water. He stared aggressively in sheer absolute disbelief at the highly thick, completely detailed legal binders directly in front of him. My father's lead corporate attorney, a deeply intimidating woman with absolutely terrifyingly sharp eyes, clearly and completely outlined exactly what those massive binders entirely contained. She calmly and methodically explained, in excruciating, highly devastating detail, that our massive corporate firm, now entirely legally owned, every single piece of Mark's absolutely massive, completely unmanageable business debt, every single one of his highly dangerous personal markers, and the entire heavily leveraged, completely toxic mortgage on Eleanor's incredibly massive, deeply fake suburban estate. The highly predatory loan documents Mark had violently brought were entirely, completely worthless, useless garbage. I said, my voice cold, steady, and devoid of any remaining sympathy or foolish love. You genuinely thought you had successfully trapped a poor, isolated woman you could emotionally abuse and financially exploit to temporarily save your failing, fraudulent shell company. But here is what you absolutely didn't know. You violently brought a pathetic street brawl to an overwhelming corporate war. Eleanor suddenly let out a sharp, pathetic gasp, violently clutching her fake designer handbag to her chest as the terrifying reality of her destroyed social status finally hit her. She aggressively and loudly demanded to know exactly what was going to legally happen to her cherished, sprawling home. My father, completely without looking at her, calmly informed her that the massive legal foreclosure process had already officially begun yesterday afternoon, and she had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the heavily armed county sheriffs arrived to forcibly remove her possessions from the deeply leveraged property. Mark completely lost his highly fragile, volatile temper, violently slamming his heavy fists directly onto the polished granite table in a desperate display of pathetic rage. He loudly screamed that this was completely illegal, aggressively threatening to sue our corporate firm for unprecedented financial damages and publicly ruin our entire reputation in the city's financial sector. My father slowly chuckled, a terrifying, dark sound that chilled the massive, intimidating room instantly to its core. He calmly and carefully slid a single, thin manila folder directly across the heavy granite table, stopping exactly in front of Mark's violently shaking, heavily sweating hands. It clearly and undeniably documented every single instance of massive illegal financial fraud, dangerous offshore wire transfers, and fraudulent tax evasion Mark had secretly committed over the last 4 disastrous years. My father calmly suggested he sit down before he made a catastrophic mistake he could never undo, smoothly noting that the FBI would be highly interested in his entirely disastrous accounting practices. You are absolutely not going to sue anyone, Mark, my father quietly, dangerously stated, his terrifying eyes locking directly onto Mark's violently trembling, sweating face. Because if you ever attempt to fight this legal corporate acquisition, I will hand this heavily documented file directly over to the aggressive federal prosecutors instantly. You will spend the next 20 years in a heavily secured federal penitentiary, entirely stripped of your pathetic, fake social status, surviving in a concrete cell far away from your precious country clubs. The absolute, deafening silence in the massive boardroom violently returned, incredibly heavier and massively more suffocating than ever before. Mark entirely collapsed heavily into the massive leather chair, his heavily sweating face bearing into his trembling hands, as the true weight of his absolute destruction crushed his lungs. The arrogant, abusive man who had violently slapped me in a private dining room just 14 days ago was completely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified criminal, rapidly realizing he was completely, inescapably trapped in his own web of absolute deceit. I slowly and deliberately stood up from the massive, heavily polished granite table, smoothing down the front of my modest dress with absolutely steady, confident hands. I looked directly down at the pathetic, completely broken family sitting highly destroyed directly in front of me. Eleanor was openly weeping, violently sobbing directly into her cheap handkerchief, her precious, manufactured social world absolutely collapsing violently around her ears. She would have to move into a tiny, subsidized apartment and explain her massive, highly public downfall to all of her judgmental, deeply vicious country club friends who would undoubtedly shun her forever. David, the deeply useless, profoundly lazy brother, was staring completely blankly directly at the polished wall, unable to process the absolute devastation of his pathetic life and the undeniable reality that he would actually have to find a minimum wage job. I felt absolutely no pity, no regret, and no lingering sadness as I meticulously surveyed the complete, perfectly engineered wreckage of their toxic, abusive lives. The heavy, completely non-negotiable divorce papers are perfectly waiting directly inside that thick legal binder, right in front of your shaking hands. I absolutely calmly stated to Mark, completely without a single shred of remaining empathy, "You will completely sign them directly right now, absolutely without a single contested condition. You will walk away from everything we ever shared. You will immediately surrender any desperate claim to alimony, and you will absolutely never contact me ever again for the rest of your miserable life." I didn't wait for his pathetic, highly predictable apologies or his desperate, groveling pleas for mercy. I slowly turned my back on them, my heels clicking sharply and authoritatively against the beautiful, polished marble floor, leaving them completely to drown inside the massive, inescapable destruction of their own making. As I walked into the private executive elevator and the heavy steel doors finally slid shut, I took a deep, profoundly clean breath of perfectly filtered air, feeling entirely light, completely free, and wildly victorious. The heavy, highly polished steel doors of the private executive elevator smoothly slid shut, entirely cutting off the pathetic, highly desperate sounds of Eleanor's loud sobbing and Mark's terrified, highly frantic hyperventilating. As the quiet, high-speed elevator rapidly descended the massive 60 stories toward the main lobby, I deeply closed my eyes and simply let the absolute, undeniable magnitude of what had just transpired completely wash over me. The suffocating, incredibly heavy weight of the last 4 highly abusive years was entirely, completely lifted from my shoulders, rapidly replaced by an intoxicating, deeply profound sense of absolute peace. I confidently walked out through the massive glass-walled lobby of my father's impressive corporate headquarters, offering a genuine, deeply warm smile to the sharply dressed security guards who respectfully held the heavy glass doors open for me. The bright, highly energetic mid-morning sun instantly hit my face as I stepped out onto the bustling, highly crowded city sidewalk, and for the absolutely first time in almost half a decade, I felt completely and undeniably like myself again. The immediate, highly chaotic fallout over the next several weeks was exactly as utterly catastrophic and deeply humiliating for Mark's highly toxic family as my father and his aggressive legal team had mathematically calculated. Within exactly 48 hours of the disastrous boardroom meeting, the highly aggressive corporate lawyers officially and completely foreclosed on Eleanor's heavily mortgaged, highly prized suburban estate. She was legally, violently forced to hastily pack her deeply fake designer clothing and highly cheap costume jewelry into standard brown cardboard boxes under the deeply terrifying, strictly uncompromising supervision of heavily armed county sheriffs. The absolute, undeniable scandal violently ripped through her precious, highly exclusive country club community like a massive, highly destructive wildfire, entirely destroying her carefully manufactured social reputation overnight. Her formerly loyal, highly vicious socialite friends entirely abandoned her completely, instantly, brutally gossiping about her highly embarrassing, entirely public financial ruin at the very same expensive charity luncheons she used to aggressively dominate. The sheer speed of my father's brilliant corporate acquisition team was absolutely terrifying to silently behold. Within exactly 1 week of our highly devastating boardroom meeting, every single one of Mark's heavily leveraged bank accounts was completely frozen and legally seized. The aggressive private contractors he had desperately avoided paying for nearly a year finally received their money, but it came directly from my father's massive holding company, meaning Mark's entirely fraudulent shell corporation was officially and permanently dissolved. The highly expensive, heavily leased, luxury vehicles he had used to desperately project an illusion of massive wealth were aggressively repossessed right out of the cracked driveway of his mother's former estate. He was entirely forced to watch, completely powerless and heavily sweating, in a cheap t-shirt, as a massive tow truck slowly hauled away his heavily prized Italian sports car. The massive, highly arrogant corporate developer who had violently struck me across the face in a private dining room was suddenly reduced to aggressively begging his former business associates for entirely humiliating minimum wage clerical jobs just to desperately pay his mounting legal fees. David, the deeply spoiled, completely useless younger brother, experienced a highly similar, entirely catastrophic reality check that violently shattered his pathetic existence. Without his mother's heavily leveraged, highly toxic estate to secretly fund his deeply lazy lifestyle, and without Mark's entirely fraudulent business to endlessly siphon stolen cash from, David was completely and undeniably destitute for the first time in his entire adult life. He actually had the absolute, unbelievable audacity to aggressively bypass my highly expensive legal representation and violently show up at my modest, entirely unexciting office building to desperately bug for a tiny fraction of the massive restaurant loan we had initially discussed. I didn't say a word. I just smiled politely, slowly picking up my office phone and completely calmly instructing the building's heavily armed security team to aggressively escort him directly off the private premises. The absolute look of pure, unadulterated shock and profound humiliation on his highly pathetic face as two massive guards forcefully grabbed his arms is an entirely beautiful, highly satisfying memory I will happily cherish for the rest of my life. The highly anticipated legal divorce proceedings were entirely, shockingly fast and absolutely brutally efficient, entirely devoid of the massive, highly dramatic courtroom battles Mark had always aggressively threatened me with. He simply could not physically find a single, highly respected corporate lawyer in the entire massive city who was remotely willing to legally cross my incredibly powerful, deeply feared father. Every single expensive legal firm completely dropped Mark's highly toxic case the exact second they fully reviewed the heavy, completely undeniable FBI dossier meticulously detailing his massive, highly dangerous offshore financial fraud. Mark was absolutely, completely terrified of spending his entire adult life inside a heavily secured federal penitentiary, so he quietly and completely signed away absolutely everything. He completely legally surrendered the beautiful, well-maintained marital home I had personally funded, entirely waived his deeply pathetic right to request a single penny of spousal support, and absolutely agreed to a permanent, highly restrictive restraining order that legally prevented him from ever aggressively contacting me again. Looking back, that was my first mistake during our entire marriage, falsely believing that a deeply insecure, highly abusive man would ever magically change into a loving partner, simply because I offered him endless patience and massive financial stability. Now, you need to understand something deeply fundamental about completely severing ties with highly toxic, deeply narcissistic abusers. They never actually take any personal accountability for their massive failures. Even as Mark was violently forced to completely move into a tiny, deeply depressing 2-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood with his constantly weeping, absolutely miserable mother, he desperately continued to blame everyone else for his total destruction. He aggressively told anyone who would still pitifully listen to his rambling excuses that he was entirely targeted by a massive, highly illegal corporate conspiracy, completely refusing to publicly acknowledge that his own massive arrogance and deeply violent actions had directly handed my family the exact legal weapons to utterly destroy his fragile life. The sheer delusion was absolutely profound. The silence in the room was deafening when the heavy, final judge's gavel sharply dropped, legally and permanently ending the entirely toxic, highly abusive 5-year marriage I had so foolishly tried to desperately save. I slowly walked out of the massive, highly intimidating county courthouse, completely alone, completely ignoring Mark's heavily bloodshot, deeply hateful eyes glaring aggressively at my back from across the highly polished wooden benches. He was entirely wearing a heavily wrinkled, highly outdated cheap suit, completely looking exactly like the completely broken, deeply pathetic, massive failure he truly was, underneath his fake, manufactured arrogance. I did not loudly celebrate, I did not aggressively taunt him, and I certainly did not offer him a single highly emotional, deeply dramatic final farewell speech. The absolute most devastating revenge you can possibly inflict upon a deeply narcissistic abuser is complete, absolute apathy. I entirely erased his pathetic existence from my completely beautiful, highly peaceful reality, absolutely leaving him to desperately rot in the massive, highly inescapable prison of his own terrible choices. It has now been exactly 18 completely blissful, incredibly peaceful months since that highly devastating, entirely catastrophic final confrontation in my father's massive corporate boardroom, and my actual reality is completely unrecognizable from the dark nightmare I previously lived. I eventually decided to completely sell the beautiful, heavily tainted marital home, entirely using the massive influx of clean, highly legal cash to quietly purchase a completely stunning, incredibly peaceful mid-century modern house nestled deeply into the dense, heavily wooded hills outside the massive city. I completely poured my entire focus back into my highly successful, deeply fulfilling career in data analysis, rapidly securing a massive corporate promotion that entirely drastically increased my already comfortable, highly independent personal salary. I wake up absolutely every single morning in a completely quiet, incredibly safe home, deeply entirely free from the massive suffocating anxiety of walking entirely on eggshells around a violently unpredictable, highly dangerous tyrant. The absolute peace of mind is an incredibly expensive luxury that I will absolutely never violently compromise for another human being ever again. I still occasionally hear completely pathetic, highly predictable updates about Mark and his incredibly toxic family entirely through the highly aggressive, incredibly fast-moving city grapevine, though I absolutely never actively seek the information out myself. Eleanor, the completely former matriarch of high society, entirely works as a deeply bitter, highly resentful greeter at a massive, incredibly generic wholesale discount store. She spends her entire long, physically exhausting shifts aggressively scowling at completely normal, highly hardworking people, deeply clutching onto the absolute last, pathetic shreds of her completely fake, highly manufactured superiority complex while she hands out cheap promotional flyers. The deeply vicious, highly judgmental country club socialites she previously violently ruled over now entirely intentionally drive massively out of their way just to secretly shop at her exact store, purely to highly aggressively mock her deeply humiliating, entirely public massive downfall. The sheer, deeply poetic irony of her completely pathetic new reality is an absolute masterpiece of cosmic justice. Mark's completely pathetic, entirely tragic new reality is somehow deeply, significantly worse, highly perfectly fitting for the deeply abusive, violently arrogant man who completely genuinely believed he was entirely an untouchable corporate genius. He absolutely failed to ever secure another highly prestigious, heavily overpaid corporate real estate position, entirely directly due to his massive, completely undeniable reputation as a deeply toxic, highly fraudulent, massive liability. He now currently entirely works incredibly long, deeply exhausting night shifts, managing a highly depressing, incredibly run-down used car lot, located completely on the dangerous, highly industrial outskirts of the massive city. He aggressively spends his incredibly miserable nights slowly wandering the completely empty, heavily gravel-filled lot, deeply surrounded by heavily rusted, incredibly cheap vehicles that perfectly mirror his highly destroyed, completely pathetic life. The incredibly expensive single malt scotch he completely violently demanded is entirely gone, completely replaced by highly cheap, incredibly terrible domestic beer he quietly drinks alone in his deeply miserable, highly depressing, tiny apartment. David's highly expected, completely massive failure to aggressively adapt to absolute reality entirely completely resulted in him moving completely back into that tiny, deeply depressing apartment with Mark and their constantly weeping mother, creating a completely perfect, highly toxic echo chamber of deep misery. The three of them absolutely constantly, aggressively scream at each other entirely through the heavily thin, completely cheap apartment walls, violently, loudly blaming each other for their massive, highly public, complete destruction. They are completely and entirely trapped in a massively heavy, incredibly suffocating prison, entirely constructed from their own deep greed, massive arrogance, and absolute, completely undeniable stupidity. My deeply brilliant, highly terrifying father completely kept his absolute legal promise, completely indefinitely holding the massive, highly devastating federal fraud file entirely over Mark's completely pathetic head. It serves as an absolutely permanent, highly heavy sword completely dangling dangerously above him, completely legally guaranteeing he will absolutely never, ever attempt to aggressively rebuild his fake, highly toxic corporate empire ever again. Looking back on everything, I realize now that the most massive, highly transformative lesson I completely learned was entirely about the absolute, completely undeniable nature of true, heavy boundaries and deeply quiet, massive personal power. Toxic, highly abusive people, like Mark and his completely terrible family, entirely deeply rely on your highly emotional, completely predictable reactions to actively maintain their absolute fake, massive control over your entire precious life. They desperately, violently want you to scream. They actively need you to aggressively cry. And they highly, completely depend on your massive, deep fear to physically feel their entire pathetic, completely manufactured sense of massive superiority.